We're at a real crossroads right now, and you recently delivered your 2024 State of the World speech, where you talk about where we are now and where we are going, both domestically and internationally. So let's first start at home, where we sit right now, a week out from Election Day. How different will both the United States and the world look under a Harris presidency versus a Trump one?
Pretty dramatically different. I mean, there's no question these are two candidates with very different worldviews. And I would say, first of all, we want to look at a place like Russia, Ukraine. Trump is much more of a unilateralist. So he wants to end the war. So does Kamala. But his way of ending the war would be calling Zelensky and Putin individually, saying, that's it. No more fighting, ceasefire where we are. Otherwise, I'm going to cut off your aid, Ukraine. Otherwise, I'm going to sanction you a lot more strongly. Kamala Harris would be a much more multilateralist. She would coordinate with the allies in Europe, common NATO position, bring the Ukrainians on board, and try to have a negotiating position with Russia collectively with the allies in Ukraine. So very different way of trying to bring the war to an end. On the Middle East, Biden has been extremely pro-Israel. Trump arguably even a little more so, in the sense that he would be actively supportive of Israel expanding its war into Iran to remove Iran's nuclear capabilities, and might be willing to help the Israelis with that. He no longer supports a two-state solution, though he did back when he was president the first time around. Kamala Harris would certainly still be very strongly pro-Israel, but more interested in ensuring that the Palestinians have humanitarian aid that's adequate, something Trump doesn't really care about, and also proactively pushing a two-state solution. So different, definitely, between the two. And then finally on China, the other big issue out there, a Trump administration much more focused on higher tariffs, has talked about 60% tariffs on all Chinese exports across the board, something the Chinese are very scared of, especially given that their economy is not doing very well right now. Could lead to a deal, but also could easily lead to major escalation between the two countries, where a Harris administration would be very, very similar to what we've seen from Biden. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just was in Beijing a couple weeks ago, spent a couple of days with the foreign minister and then the president to help ensure that a transition, if Harris wins, is smooth, something that the Chinese government appreciated. So those are, I think, the big differences on the top issues out there.
Lot of geopolitical movements right now. So let's start with the one you started with first, the Russia-Ukraine war. Obviously, Ukraine has been at war with Russia since Russia invaded in February of 2022. Let's say Harris becomes president, there's that more multilateral approach like you talked about. Would that end the conflict faster than if Trump was president and there was that more isolated approach?
It's quite possible that Trump's approach would end the war more quickly, but it might not end the war in a more stable way. I mean, first, the fact that Ukraine wouldn't have any hard security guarantees, at least not from the Americans, and certainly wouldn't be joining NATO, means that longer term, Russia's ability to rearm, rebuild, and have another bite at that apple becomes more likely than in a multilateral approach, where all of NATO is together with the Ukrainians in a negotiating position. So perhaps more likely that it ends the war quickly, but less likely that it's sustainable long term. By the way, Trump's Afghanistan deal with the Taliban got the war over faster than you otherwise would have expected. The outcome long term was less stable, right? So it's a kind of a question of be careful what you wish for.
So when you're saying be careful what you wish for, do you think the world as a whole, our allies, are wishing for a Harris presidency because that would end that conflict in a much more stable way?
I think that it is not easy to say everybody wants one thing. There are certainly some allies that would prefer a Trump administration. Israel would prefer a Trump administration. I think it's possible that Turkey would prefer a Trump administration. And India doesn't care. They're happy either way. I would say most other allies would prefer a Harris administration. Almost all of the Europeans, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and South Korea, pretty clearly would prefer Harris. And some of that is because Harris cares more about allies. Harris cares more about multilateralism. I mean, a self-described America First policy of Trump is, let's face it, not exactly intended to make allies feel like they're going to be valued or treated well. And I think that has, in a sense, undermined his brand with a lot of these countries, and a lot of their experience dealing with him in the first term was challenged in that way.